All right, let's dive into a really fascinating story. Imagine a time, not that long ago, when just a handful of companies basically held the entire American economy in their grip. It's an incredible story of how the people decided to fight back, using a single, powerful law designed to tame these titans of industry.
And that really begs the question, right? What happens when a company gets too powerful? This was the big, urgent question facing the U.S. in the late 1800s. See, after the Civil War, the economy was just exploding, and something totally new, and honestly kind of scary, was starting to take shape.
We're talking about the rise of these absolute Goliaths of the Gilded Age. With railroads suddenly crisscrossing the entire country, companies could now serve a national market, and that meant they could grow to a size that was just unimaginable before.
And if you're looking for the poster child of this new era, look no further than the Standard Oil Company. This was John D. Rockefeller's baby. And I mean, it wasn't just big, it was an absolute force of nature, a symbol of this new, unchecked corporate power.
So you might be wondering, how did they get so powerful? Well, it wasn't always pretty. They used some really aggressive tactics to just crush the competition. We're talking about pressuring railroads for secret discounts, slashing prices in one town to drive a local competitor out of business, and then, once they were on their knees, swooping in to buy them up. And they organized all these newly acquired companies into this clever legal structure called a trust.
And spoiler alert, it worked. I mean, it really worked. By 1879, think about how fast that is, they had a complete stranglehold on the entire oil refining industry. The term trust pretty much became slang for any giant monopoly. And soon you had trusts controlling everything: sugar, whiskey, you name it.
Okay, but as these trusts got bigger and bigger, people started to push back. Farmers, small business owners, regular folks, they all felt like the game was rigged, and they started demanding, loud and clear, that the government step in and do something about it. And that public outcry, it got so loud it reached all the way to the White House. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison officially called on Congress to act. The pressure was just getting to be too much for either political party to just ignore anymore.
And the way Harrison framed this was brilliant. He didn't just talk about economics, he talked about democracy. He even quoted Lincoln, saying this was about preserving a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I mean, the argument was pretty simple, right? How can you have a government for the people if a few massive companies are calling all the shots?
So the political momentum was just unstoppable. A bill gets introduced by Senator John Sherman of Ohio, and it basically just sails through Congress. And get this, it passed with only one person voting against it. I mean, can you imagine that happening today? That's how you know this was a big deal.
And the result was the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was a truly landmark law, the first of its kind in the United States. Its goal was simple: to outlaw monopolies and any kind of restraint of trade. For the first time, America had a real weapon to fight back against the trusts.
But of course, having a law is one thing. Actually using it against the most powerful companies in the country, that's a whole different ballgame. The trusts weren't just going to roll over, and the first major battles were fought in the courtroom.
And right out of the gate, the law hit a major snag. Just 5 years in 1895, a Supreme Court decision basically kneecapped the act. In a case against the big sugar trusts, the court made this really fine distinction. They said, hey, manufacturing isn't the same as commerce. So if a company built a monopoly just by buying up a bunch of factories, well, that wasn't illegal under the act. This created a massive, massive loophole.
Now, even with that legal setback, the public wasn't giving up. The demand for action was still there, it was still strong. I mean, you can see it in powerful statements like this one from a congressional commission at the time. Everyone knew the problem wasn't going away, it was actually getting worse.
So this created a really strange paradox in the law's early days. It was effective at stopping a bunch of separate companies from getting together to, say, fix prices. But because of that Supreme Court ruling, it was pretty much powerless to stop those same companies from just merging into one single giant monopoly.
And of course, what do you think happened? Companies totally exploited that loophole. The late 1890s saw this huge boom in mergers. I mean, we're talking about the creation of corporations on a scale nobody had ever seen before, culminating in giants like the billion-dollar U.S. Steel Corporation. The problem was spinning out of control.
But don't worry, the story doesn't end there. This flawed, imperfect law was about to get a second wind and really find its teeth.
And that was thanks, in large part, to a new kind of president stepping onto the scene.
And that president was Theodore Roosevelt. He earned the nickname the Trust Buster for a reason. He just wasn't afraid to take these giants on. He started using the Sherman Act way more aggressively. And a huge turning point was in 1904 when he used it to block a massive railroad merger. This was a clear signal that the game had changed.
And that really set the stage for a whole century of antitrust action. The Sherman Act was the weapon used to finally break up Standard Oil itself in 1911. Later on, new laws like the Clayton Act came along and added more tools to the kit. And this whole foundation led to some of the biggest cases in history, like the famous breakup of the telephone giant AT&T all the way in 1982.
It's pretty amazing, right? What started as this flawed, imperfect weapon grew to become the absolute centerpiece of America's antitrust law. It's basically the legal DNA for the idea of a fair marketplace, and its influence is still felt today in everything from airline mergers to how we think about regulating the huge tech companies.
And that brings us to the big question for today. We live in an era of new titans, right? Giants in tech, in finance. And so the questions that were being asked back in 1890 are, you could argue, more relevant than ever. What is the role of this act today? How do we make sure the marketplace is fair for everyone? And maybe most importantly, what role should we play in shaping the rules for the giants of our own time?